In this video, we'll be using the Nitric Framework to build an API that interacts with and stores profiles in a cloud document collection. The Nitric Framework makes it as simple as possible to create an API, test it locally, and deploy it to the cloud all within the same codebase. So let's get started. You'll want to make sure you have both Node and the Nitric CLI before you start. We'll start by creating our Nitric project using the Nitric new command. This will prompt us for a name, a template, and a glob that points to our function handlers. Once we've created our project and opened it in our favorite text editor, we can open the hello.ts file in the functions directory. We'll start by removing the template code and adding the collections import from the Nitric SDK at the top. We'll then define our API, naming it public, define our profiles collection, naming it profiles, and then adding permissions to the collection for writing and reading. Let's resolve our dependencies using yarn install. We can then add the uid_v4 package using yarn. We can then import the uid function at the top of our API file. This package will be used to generate our individual user IDs for the profiles collection. We'll start our API by defining a route for creating a new user. This will be a post request to the profiles endpoint. It accepts a context object which stores the request and response objects. We use this context to extract the new user's properties from the request JSON body by destructuring the object. We can then generate a UUID for our new user and create a new document with that ID on the profiles collection. We'll then set the contents as the new user's name, age, and hometown, which will be stored within the collections document. We'll then add a response body, which will have a success message stating the profile has been successfully created. This message will also contain the ID so that we can use it in future requests. Let's now create a route for getting a user by its ID. This route will have the ID as a path parameter and another context object for storing the request and response. We will extract the ID from the path params and then use it to get the document with that ID from the profiles collection. We can then return this document as JSON. The get method on the document object will throw an error if it can't find a document with the ID specified. We account for this by catching the error and returning a response status code of 404 not found. We'll accompany this with a message stating that a profile with that ID could not be found. Let's also write another route for getting all the profiles. This will just query all the documents on the profiles collection, fetch them, and return them as a JSON response. We also want to be able to delete our users, so let's write a delete route, which will take an ID as a path parameter. Let's first extract the ID from the path params, then delete the document with this ID. If the collection has no documents with that specific ID, it will throw an error. We'll catch this and return a 404 response and a message stating why. Our final route is going to provide an interface for updating a profile. It will have an ID parameter and a request body with an optional name, age, and hometown. We'll first extract the ID from the path params, get the document with this ID, and then get the updated user properties from the request body. We can then get the current values from the document and update them if that property is specified in the request body. If it's not specified, we'll use the current value, and we account for neither being set by returning an empty string. We can then set the document with the updated user profile, and finally, we catch the potential not found error from the get document call, returning a 404 status and a message. We can now start testing our API locally. We use the nitric run command, which containerizes our functions and starts up a local API gateway, which we can hit using a HTTP client. We're going to use curl for this, but feel free to use any HTTP client. Keep in mind, the first nitric run is going to take longer than future runs, as it needs to get the configuration from scratch and build the dev images without a cache. Once the nitric run command has outputted our endpoint, we can use curl to test our API. This will be a post request against localhost port 9001 at apis/public/profiles with a JSON request body with the new user's name, age, and hometown. Our new user profile will be Peter Parker, age 21, who is from the hometown Queens. When we submit this request, it will give us a response with our new user's ID. We can then get the user, verifying that it was added to the collection by making a GET request to localhost port 9001 at apis/public/profiles/the user ID, which we'll copy and paste from the previous response. Once we submit the request, the API will respond with our Peter Parker user that we created just before. We can now do a put request to /apis/public/profiles/our ID that we had before to update our user's information. This will be a request JSON with a new name of Ben Riley from the hometown Las Vegas. It will ignore updating the user's age by keeping it the same because it wasn't specified in the JSON request. Before testing our getAllUsers endpoint, we'll recreate the original Peter Parker user so that when we hit the endpoint, it will return 2 users. This will be both Peter Parker and Ben Riley. To do this, we'll do a GET request to /APIs/public/profiles. In the response body, you can see and verify that we have both Ben Riley and Peter Parker. Now that we have tested our API locally, we can do a deployment to AWS. But first, we need to make a Nitric stack within our project. A stack stores deployment configurations so you can do things like having a separate production and dev cloud environment. We will make this stack by doing the Nitric stack new command. It will then ask for a name for our stack, which cloud we want to deploy to, and the region we want to deploy to. We should then have a nitric-dev.yaml file, which stores these configurations if you ever want to change them. We're also now ready to do our first deployment. This will be using nitric up-s and then our stack name, which in this case is dev. It will start our deployment by provisioning and deploying all our resources and policies. One thing you will need to do if this is your very first deployment to AWS, regardless of whether you're using Nitric or not, is set up the AWS credentials file. You can follow the short guide on the AWS reference on nitric.io, which I'll leave a link in the description. Now that our resources are deployed, we will see our endpoint for the Profiles API. This will be the endpoint for the API gateway that was deployed to AWS, which means that it can also be seen on your AWS console. You can test this works the same way you did locally. However, you will need to replace the URL with this endpoint. Keep in mind, if you have multiple APIs, it would print out multiple endpoints. When you do want to destroy your stack, you can run the nitric down-s and then the stack name, which in this case is dev. This will destroy your entire stack and you will need to redeploy, so do so cautiously and only when you need to. Congratulations, we've just successfully built, tested, and deployed an API to the cloud. If you want to expand on this API, there are a heap of guides on our website, like integrating with Stripe or turning this API into a GraphQL API. If this guide was useful and you want to see more, please leave a comment or reach out to us on GitHub and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.